So now that we have a good basis and foundation for what human genetics and that study is all about, we can start looking at actual pieces associated with genetics with humans. The first idea that we're going to be going over, and this first flowchart will be entitled Recessively Inherited Disorders, and this is going to be part 1. So we'll say Roman numeral 1. So recessively inherited disorders, and this will be Roman numeral 1. There will be a second part, maybe a third part as well. So, basic idea behind this flowchart is just to give you an introduction as to what recessively inherited disorders are. Now, you probably already have a good understanding of what it means to be recessive, what it means to be dominant, and the idea of masking. Same idea is going to be implemented, but now on a human scale. Let's reiterate one thing. What we understand and know from genetics, hopefully thus far, is that genes are things that are going to code for specific proteins. This is what life is all about. Remember the central dogma of biology. Genes code for proteins, and we hope that those proteins will complete their specific functions. So we'll say proteins have very specific, very important functions necessary for life. So this is a basic fact of genetics altogether. So how does this relate back to our recessively inherited disorders? Well, sometimes these genes that code for the proteins can be inherited, and sometimes that inheritance can be faulty, in the sense that we can state the following. Alleles that cause, let's say an allele that causes a genetic disorder, because a lot of this lecture is all about looking at disorder. An allele that causes, we'll call it a genetic disorder, would instead code for something else. Okay, we'll say codes, because this is what it's all about, codes for what? Okay, dot dot dot. Build some suspense for yourself. So here, genes code for proteins. Proteins have a specific function. Cool. What happens, and this is supposed to say allele, so I'll put an E here. What happens if if an allele that causes a genetic disorder happens? And if this situation occurs, we're going to have the following. There is going to be a genetic disorder, something not normal. Thus, this allele that's not normal and coding for something not normal might code for, let's say, a malfunctioning protein. So that is not good, because if there's a malfunctioning protein, then there's a malfunctioning function. Okay, mal meaning bad, function. Bad functioning protein, thus bad specific function that it's supposed to normally do. Or you can even have the situation in which there's no protein at all. The protein or the genetic disorder itself does not allow for any protein whatsoever to be coded for or be made. Now, we can further our discussion by stating that if the disease allele is recessive, okay, so this is something I think is a bit of a, let's say, looking back at something we've already established. If the disease allele, okay, in question is recessive, okay, if it is indeed recessive, because this is about recessively inherited disorders, if it is recessive, we can have the situation in which we have a heterozygote, right? And if we have a heterozygote in a recessive allele disease situation, what type of phenotype does the heterozygote have? Normal or abnormal? Remember, a heterozygote has the ability to mask recessive alleles. So you're going to be masking the disease, and thus you will have a relatively normal exterior, meaning that you'll have a normal phenotype. You will look normal. In addition, if you are heterozygote, and if the disease allele is recessive in this random made-up situation, you are not only a normal phenotype, but you have to also be aware and understand that this heterozygote individual is a carrier. They are a carrier of the recessive allele, so REC for recessive allele. This is an important distinction to understand that the normal phenotype, which would show up as something like, let's say, big A, little a, will also include the fact that this person is a carrier for this recessive allele. And if you have the recessive allele, you are thus a carrier for the disease as well. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you express the disease, you express the genotype, but you, of course, are a carrier for this disease. This is your, of course, let's remember, this is our genotype. So do not forget the distinction between genotype and phenotype and the idea behind recessive and dominant masking, okay? The big idea here is that a heterozygote is a carrier of a recessive allele, thus they are a carrier of a disease. And finally, we're going to end this introduction by stating the following. Most people with a recessive disorder, so we'll say REC disorder because that's what we're talking about in this flowchart. Most people with recessive disorder are usually born to what we consider, what we just established, born to carrier parents. Okay, so that's what we'll call them, carrier parents. Meaning that if we have mom mating with dad, you have this mating event, you would imagine that these both are carriers. If they're both carriers, okay, that says carrier parents, what would be their genotypes? Same exact thing as we did here. They would both be AA. Look, mom is carrying the recessive allele. Is she expressing it? No, because it's being masked by her dominant allele. Over here, dad is the same exact thing. He is a carrier. He is a normal phenotype. But what usually happens is if you have this cross, if you have a carrier parent, sometimes you can have and eventually result in an offspring that has the recessive disease. This will oftentimes give you an offspring, okay? So we'll have an offspring, oh, not an offspring, but we'll say little a offspring. Little a offspring. You should be able to tell me what is the likelihood of the little a offspring. And this likelihood is going to tell us that this is the same likelihood for showing a recessive disease, okay? So look, two healthy parents, two normal, phenotypically normal parents can give birth to somebody who has the recessive disease, okay? So the recessive disease, though it was masked in the parents, shows back up in us as humans. Now, this is an important note. The reason why you have to understand this is because this is actually how most human genetic disorder and disease, let's say most human genetic disease actually shows up just like this situation right here, in which two parents who have no idea that they're carriers because they can't tell that they're carriers, they look and act completely normal. Most human genetic disease, let's say, is inherited, okay, because this is all about inheritance, this is all about genetics, is inherited at what we would call a single locus, meaning one location for a gene, single locus autosomal, meaning that non-sex cells, non-gametes, excuse me, not sex cells, but non-gametes, okay, autosomal means body cells, recessive trait. So let me just repeat this one more time, it's a lot of words here. So we state that most human genetic disease is inherited at single locus autosomal recessive trait. So what do we mean by this? Well, what I have here is the A locus. This is the A locus. What we state here is that most human genetic disease is a result of recessive traits showing up at one locus, that is a body cell locus, that is an autosomal locus, such as this. This is a recessive trait that would show up in the autosomes of every single cell, and thus the entire organism, the entire offspring, will express a recessive disease. So this is the basic idea behind recessively inherited disorders. Understand that this is the most common way for a human genetic disease to show up. And this is most common because mom and dad have no idea that they're carriers for this. And they assume that because they are phenotypically normal, their offspring will be phenotypically normal. But that is not always the case because of the recessive trait that sometimes shows back up. Thus, the recessive disease is expressed in the offspring.